So today we're going to dive into a pretty powerful thought experiment from the source material. What if instead of just watching from a distance, world leaders actually chose dialogue for Sudan? We're going to walk through a hypothetical summit, one that's designed to map out a real comprehensive pathway to peace. You know, this quote from Christiane Amanpour, it really just sets the stage perfectly, doesn't it? It's such a powerful reminder of the human cost of this conflict. We hear about geopolitics, but this is about what was actually lost. A whole culture, a rhythm, just silenced. Okay, so here's the roadmap for how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the idea of the summit itself. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, how to actually get a ceasefire, how to deal with the devastating humanitarian crisis, aligning all the regional powers, tackling the tough question of justice, and finally, looking forward to what a rebuilt Sudan could even look like. All right, let's get into it. So our first section really gets to the heart of this whole thought experiment. What if you could actually get everyone in a room? Not just to talk strategy, but to start treating peace like something that is everyone's shared responsibility. Now, it's super important to be clear here. What we're walking through isn't a news report on something that actually happened. It's a what-if scenario, constructed in the source, a kind of imagined dialogue between key figures. Their different perspectives are used to explore all the complex, competing ideas that would be on the table in a situation like this. Okay, so that brings us to the first and honestly the most urgent challenge, getting the guns to go silent. And not just for a few hours, but in a way that actually lasts. Because let's be real, without that, nothing else can even begin. And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've seen ceasefires get announced before, and they fall apart almost immediately. The dialogue in the source really tries to grapple with what it would actually take, not just politically, but personally, for these guys to make this one stick. So the source material frames this whole debate through some really well-known voices. One perspective, a very pragmatic, almost business-like approach, is articulated through the voice of Donald Trump. The idea here is pretty straightforward. You can't just ask them to stop. You have to make peace the most profitable option on the table. It's a deal. It's all about leverage. But then, on the flip side, you get this direct contrast. The perspective from former South African President Thabo Mbeki frames it in a totally different light. He basically argues that peace can't just be a cold transaction. It has to be an African-led process, one that's built on trust and gives both sides a dignified way to back down. And this slide just lays out those two competing philosophies so clearly. On one hand, you've got peace as a deal. It's all about leverage, profit, and top-down enforcement. On the other, you have peace as dignity, based on trust, African leadership, and a sense of shared destiny. The really crucial insight here is that any solution that's actually going to work would probably need a little bit of both. So, with that political puzzle on the table, the dialogue has to pivot to the immediate human catastrophe, the very real threat of famine, and the massive challenge of getting food to people while the fighting is still going on. I mean, this quote from Sudanese activist Allah Asala is just, it's gut-wrenching. It completely cuts through all the high-level strategy and politics and gets right to the raw human reality of what's happening on the ground. It's a stark reminder of why this is so urgent. And the sheer scale of this is just staggering. We're not talking about a few thousand people. We're talking about millions facing famine. When you have a number that big, this stops being just a political problem. It becomes an existential crisis for the entire country. So what do? Well, the source outlines a very concrete three-step plan. Step 1 is protection. Create these rolling 72-hour windows for aid with armed escorts. Then you establish secure corridors that are basically untouchable. And finally, you lock it all down with a formal accord signed by the generals with real financial penalties if they break the rules. Now, that idea of getting regional powers to sponsor those aid corridors, well, that brings us to the next big layer of complexity. See, peace in Sudan isn't just about what's happening inside its borders. It is deeply, deeply tangled up in the competing interests of its powerful neighbors. And this table gives you a quick snapshot of what's at stake for the key players. For Saudi Arabia, it's about trade and keeping things stable. For the UAE, it's all about their economic corridors. And for Egypt, this is an existential security issue, from keeping the conflict from spilling over its border to the future of the Nile itself. So how in the world do you get all these different competing interests to pull in the same direction? The dialogue proposes this 5-pillar pact. It's basically a framework to get everyone to share responsibility. You'd have the AU and the UN handling enforcement, the Gulf states and Egypt covering security and a big investment fund, and, this is key, real consequences for anyone who breaks the rules, all happening out in the open. And now we come to what might be the hardest question of all in any situation like this. How do you go after justice for absolutely horrific war crimes without completely blowing up the fragile peace process you're trying to build? And once again, you see these two fundamentally different ways of thinking. The phased camp is pragmatic. They say, look, let's make peace first. Then we can worry about justice so we don't scare the bad actors away from the table. But the counterargument, no peace without truth, is just as powerful. It says that ignoring justice just creates a cycle of violence, and that for real healing to happen, you have to acknowledge the suffering of the victims. So, what's a possible way forward? The source presents this idea of a hybrid court, and it's a fascinating concept designed to bridge that gap. It would combine international legal standards and judges with local Sudanese laws and jurists. The goal is to deliver a form of justice that feels both legitimate to the outside world and truly owned by the people of Sudan. And that brings us, finally, to the most hopeful part of this whole pathway, the vision for what comes after the fighting stops. This isn't just about rebuilding bridges and buildings. It's about rebuilding the very soul of a nation. This question really reframes the entire section. It shifts our focus away from the generals and the politicians and puts it on the people who carried the spirit of the 2019 revolution. The young people, the women, the ones who have the most at stake in building a peace that actually lasts. And this vision, it's just so comprehensive. It's not just about money, it's about moral reconstruction, a government based on competence, not who you know. It's about genuine social inclusion, making sure the women and youth who led the revolution finally get their seat at the table. It's about economic ownership, so the country's wealth actually benefits its people. And so critically, it's about cultural revival, reclaiming that national spirit through art, music, and storytelling. And we end on this really profound thought. It's such an important reminder that peace isn't some document you sign or a finish line you cross. It's a constant, daily effort. The ideas we've explored here lay out a path that is incredibly difficult, for sure, but also hopeful. It's a reminder that even after the absolute worst conflicts, the work of rebuilding and of becoming fully human is always, always possible.